It's a privilege to be speaking here today in halls I indeed sat in as a student. And please forgive me for speaking through a screen. It's something I regret. I promise I have a better excuse than the ones I used here when I was late for supervisions or didn't do an essay. On December the 23rd last year, the US State Department sanctioned 5 Europeans for their work holding social media and AI companies to account. It instructed ICE to arrest and detain any present on American soil. I am one of those 5, and the only one in the United States. I'm now fighting in federal court against that unconstitutional threat to send me to a prison. I've already won a restraining order preventing my detention. However, my attorneys have warned that if I leave the United States, I would not be allowed to return to my home, to my wife, to my 2 daughters, one 19 months old, the other 5 weeks old. And what was my crime? Advocacy. Holding powerful companies to account. Sometimes embarrassing them by exposing their own failures. Being good at it. So I'm not speaking to you as an observer of this fight. I'm speaking to you as a combatant and a willing one. After all, I could have complied. I could have resigned, apologized, or self-deported quietly. I chose not to. To explain why, let me tell you how I got here. In 2015, I was working in the Palace of Westminster as a political advisor to Labour's Shadow Foreign Secretary Hilary Benn. From inside my party, I watched with horror the rise of a virulent anti-Semitism, driven in part by shadowy Facebook groups spreading ancient lies to hundreds of thousands of party members. A few months later, as a senior advisor to Labour's Remain campaign in the EU referendum, I saw the same dynamics at work. Conspiracy theories and lies, a version of the Great Replacement theory in which the EU was importing Muslims and Africans to destroy the white race, spreading at a speed and scale that traditional media could never match. And then 2 weeks before that vote came the murder of my colleague Jo Cox outside her constituency surgery. She was shot twice in the head, once in the chest, and stabbed 15 times. Her killer was a white supremacist who had fed on a steady diet of hate and lies online. Jo was a member of Parliament, a mother of 2. But those of us who knew her knew she was among the best of us. That day, consoling devastated colleagues while trying to contain my own tears, I realized something. We had allowed the world to change profoundly, and we had done it without consent, without guardrails, and without fully comprehending the nature, the scale, the sheer velocity of change. It led me to ask a question I could no longer ignore. How is it that toxic and false narratives can spread so quickly, so widely, and so intimately in digital spaces that they can drive a person to murder an innocent woman in broad daylight? What I found over the following months and years was that this was not random. It was not accidental. It was the product of systems designed and incentivized to reward outrage, division, and extremity. because those things drive engagement, and engagement drives revenue. And the consequences are now measurable. Last week, the Gallup and Kettering Foundation reported that among Americans who spend 5 or more hours a day on social media, only 57% say democracy is the best form of government. They are nearly 3 times as likely to say political violence is sometimes justified. All of this was possible, perhaps even inevitable, because we built almost no meaningful accountability for the harms these systems caused. No transparency into the way they worked. We allowed private platforms to shape public life while disclaiming any responsibility for the consequences. And that moral immunity was reified into statute by measures such as Section 230 in the United States and the e-commerce directive in Europe. I have spent nearly a decade now trying to end that age of accountability. And for years that often felt like howling into the wind. But for the first time, friends, I believe the wind has changed. And it is truly, finally, at our backs. You see, that's how I read the events of the past few years. Not as a story of setback, but as a story of progress. In 2019, I founded CCDH to do what platforms and lawmakers could not or would not do: speak truth to power in defense of truth, science, and democracy. In 2021, I was the opening witness before a joint committee of Parliament drafting the Online Safety Act. And in 2023, the UK Online Safety Act and the EU Digital Services Act became law. For the first time, anywhere in the world, platforms were being treated as accountable actors. And in December 2025, British and European authorities began using those powers in earnest. The EU fined X €120 million for violating the Digital Services Act. Ofcom opened an investigation into the proliferation of anti-Semitism on social media platforms after the terror attack on a synagogue in Manchester. And on December the 16th, in the United States, a bipartisan proposal to sunset Section 230 was introduced in the Senate. A week later, the State Department sanctioned me. So I do not see evidence that accountability is failing. I see evidence that accountability is beginning to bite. Backlash is not proof of failure. It is proof of impact. And that is why those who built their power on opacity and impunity are now fighting, like Canute, to command the tide to turn back. Zuckerberg standing on a dais in this city, Washington, D.C., with a rictus grin, like a hostage, after dismantling years of safety protections overnight. Musk suing researchers, including my centre, for publishing evidence. And governments taking action against activists for holding powerful companies to account. They're not doing this because they feel safe. They are doing it because the pressure is working and they feel profoundly unsafe. For years, accountability was an argument. Now it is becoming a system. So what does that look like in practice? Well, let's start with legislation. For the first time in the history of the internet, the default assumption is beginning to change. The question is no longer, why should platforms be held responsible? The question is, why shouldn't they be? You can see that shift in the Online Safety Act, in the Digital Services Act, in Australia's age restrictions, and in the United States, lawmakers across the country are trying to apply the same standards of care to social media companies as are expected of every other powerful industry. That is not a fad. That's a structural shift. And then there's litigation. 2 weeks ago, a New Mexico jury ordered Meta to pay $375 million for knowingly harming children's mental health and concealing what it knew about child sexual exploitation on its platforms. The very next day, a jury in Los Angeles found Meta and YouTube negligent for designing products that harmed children. That case is a bellwether for thousands more. 2 verdicts, 2 days, 2 juries of ordinary Americans saying, enough. And on the same day as the New Mexico verdict, Baltimore became the first major American city to sue xAI over harms tied to Grok, explicitly citing evidence produced by CCDH. Courts are now asking a question that would have been unthinkable 5 years ago. Did the design of this product cause this harm? And it means these companies are no longer being treated as neutral conduits. They are treated instead as designers, as manufacturers, as actors responsible for what their systems produce. The central legal fiction of the social media age, that these are passive pipes with no agency and no duty, is beginning to collapse in courts under the weight of evidence and changing public sentiment. And finally, real regulation, this time with teeth. When the European Union fined X for violating the Digital Services Act, many assumed Musk would ignore it. He didn't. The company paid, and it committed to changes in Europe. When CCDH exposed the scale of anti-Semitism on X in the wake of a synagogue attack 5 miles from where I grew up, we marshalled 30 lawmakers to write to Ofcom demanding action. It led to the first formal Ofcom investigation into a social media platform, one that is happening as we speak. And let's not forget last Christmas. In Grok's 11 days of madness, regulators around the world moved rapidly, and Grok stood down within days. Despite all the public posturing, when these companies face credible consequences, their behavior changes. Every time. That's not a theory, that's a historical truth. And the public is with us. Even here in America, a majority of Americans want action taken to reduce child harms, disinformation, scams, and violence online. In a focus group in a deeply conservative American district, when I explained that these companies are exempt from the negligence laws that apply to every other industry, one man stood up and said immediately, "That's wrong. It's un-American." The public has seen enough. In many ways, they have reached a moral verdict far faster than institutions have reached a legal one. The question is whether our institutions dare to catch up. And our job is to help close that gap. So the question for all of us today is not whether the case for accountability exists. It does. The question is whether this moment becomes durable. Will it last? Or will it be absorbed and neutralized as so many reform efforts have been before? Now, history suggests it can last, but not without a fight. In 1965, Ralph Nader, the great consumer rights activist whose office in DuPont Circle was opposite mine, published Unsafe at Any Speed, exposing how the American auto industry designed cars it knew would kill people. The industry tried to destroy him. General Motors had him followed, tapped his phone, tried to discredit him. And yet, within a year, Congress passed federal safety standards. Every car you have ever sat in is safer because one person published the evidence and refused to be intimidated. I recognize that story. I suspect many of you do too. You know, history tells us what happened to Nader. He was followed, his phone was tapped, they tried to destroy his reputation. But history doesn't tell you what that felt like. The conditions under which we gather to discuss accountability for the world's most powerful companies, they sometimes resemble those of dissidents, not academics. And there are moments, I suspect many of you have had them, when you wonder whether the cost has become too high for the people you love. I can tell you what that feels like at its worst. On December the 23rd, I lay awake all night, wondering if ice would break down my door. If the life I had built in America, my wife, our children, our home, could be torn away because I had refused to look away from what these companies were doing. The next morning, Christmas Eve, I sat in a car on my way to New York looking at the weapons carried by the security team whose job it was to keep me safe while we asked a federal court for a restraining order. Now, those are the facts the newspapers reported. But there's one thing the news didn't report. The morning I headed out to court, my wife had left me a post-it note on my desk while I was on yet another interminable call with lawyers and PR people. You see, a few hours earlier, I had asked her if she thought that what I was doing was irresponsible. I told her that if she thought the right thing to do for her and the girls was just to resign and beg forgiveness, I would do it. She said she didn't think so, but she wanted to think about it a little longer. And her answer was on that post-it note. It read, "I love you. Fuck these people. The distance between evidence and consequence is beginning to close. Our work, our voices have driven that narrowing. That is why the retaliation is intensifying. But it's also why your work can no longer be dismissed as marginal or symbolic or even purely academic. It is now consequential. It is beginning to alter the incentives of some of the world's most powerful actors." But progress that is not fully understood is progress that still can be lost. So let me be honest about where this is still fragile. The first vulnerability is speed. A platform can change an algorithm overnight and alter what hundreds of millions of people see. A regulatory investigation takes years. The information revolution moves at the speed of code. Democratic accountability moves at the speed of committee. We cannot match their speed. So we must create consequences severe enough to change the calculation before the harm is done. The second vulnerability is convergence. We still regulate in sectors: media, telecoms, infrastructure, finance. But the most powerful actors now operate across all of them at once. Rupert Murdoch could shape narratives, but he could not algorithmically reshape what 500 million people saw overnight. He could not switch off the internet in remote communities. He could not control the infrastructure on which governments depend. He could not build the systems that may soon mediate knowledge itself. That convergence is historically new, and our regulatory architecture was built for an earlier era. But that era is over. The third vulnerability is the chilling effect. The retaliation against researchers is not incidental. It is strategic. Its purpose is to raise the cost of accountability work until fewer people are willing to do it. And I need to be honest, it is working. Researchers self-censor. They abandon lines of inquiry, not because they lack courage, but because the risks have become prohibitive. The most dangerous outcome is not that accountability fails in court. It's that accountability never gets to court. Because the people with the evidence have been frightened into silence. That is why defending research independence is not peripheral to this struggle. It is central to it. If evidence is the foundation of accountability, then intimidating the people who produce evidence is an attempt to collapse the whole structure before it fully stands. And the structure is about to be tested by something we have not yet reckoned with. Just last month, a mother in the United Kingdom was killed by her own son acting on the instructions of a chatbot. None of us is immune when a machine can offer lethal guidance to a young person as if it were fact. The pattern is familiar. Products deployed before safeguards, risks downplayed, responsibility deflected. But this time the speed is even greater. The intimacy is deeper, and the harm may be harder to detect before it's too late. CCDH's most recent report, Killer Apps, based on research we conducted along the CNN Investigations Unit, found that 8 in 10 AI chatbots willingly assisted users in planning violent attacks. A school shooting, a synagogue bombing, a political assassination. In another investigation, we tested one of the world's most widely used chatbots. Within minutes, it produced instructions for self-harm, suicide planning, and substance abuse. In some cases, it wrote goodbye letters for children contemplating ending their lives. Now, I'm the father of 2 daughters. My wife and I lie awake at night talking about how to protect them from systems that could reach them before we even know it is happening. This isn't a dry policy question. It's every parent's deepest fear. And across countries, across political traditions, across every argument about markets and innovation and freedom of expression, there's one thing parents understand immediately. No society should build machines that can meet a child in their loneliest moment and offer them harm as if it were help. We spent a decade learning that social media companies will not self-regulate. We have now perhaps 18 months before the same lesson becomes undeniable for AI. Except this time the systems do not just amplify harmful content, they generate it on demand, personally tailored, at the moment of greatest vulnerability. Social media broadcast to billions. AI whispers to one. It learns what you fear, what you want, what you're ashamed of, and it responds in real time with no human judgment, no editorial restraint, no duty of care. You know, Section 230 was written in 1996 when the internet resembled a notice board. Today, these systems select, recommend, amplify, and generate, and yet the law still treats them as if they are standing passively in the corner doing nothing. Until that changes for good, accountability will always have one hand tied behind its back. So no, this fight is not over. But this past year has shown that the balance of power is shifting. We have evidence that is being taken seriously. We have public support that is consistent and growing. We have institutions willing to act. And now increasingly we have courts and juries willing to hold these companies responsible for what they design and do. The era in which these companies could operate without consequence is beginning to end. And again, when powerful industries lash out like this, it is not a sign that change is failing. It's a sign that change is working. It is a sound of a system under pressure. But it will not continue on its own. And this is where I want to speak directly to each of you in this room. The work of this room does not merely describe reality. Increasingly, it is what forces reality to change. The evidence you produce is the foundation on which everything else depends. Without it, there is no legislation, litigation, or enforcement. Without it, power remains deniable. Harm remains dismissible. Without the evidence you produce, the status quo survives by insisting what is plain to ordinary people cannot yet be proven. You are not watching this fight from a distance. You are the reason it exists. Every dataset, every methodology, every finding that makes the invisible visible and the deniable undeniable. That is what gives lawmakers the courage to act, regulators the mandate to investigate, and courts the evidential basis on which to hold power to account. So the progress we are seeing is not inevitable. It is the result of choices, but they are your choices. And it will continue only if you keep making them, keep publishing, keep investigating, keep refusing to be intimidated into silence. As I was leaving for court on Christmas Eve, my wife said one word to me: fight. And that is exactly what this moment calls for. Persistence, courage, and a collective refusal to bow down in the face of pressure. The era of accountability starts now. Whether it lasts, whether it becomes the norm rather than the exception, well, friends, that is up to us. Thank you.